Hello, students. Let us see T.S. Eliot, Metaphysical Poets. Right? Metaphysical poetry. The term metaphysical poetry or metaphysics in poetry is the fruit of Renaissance tree. Right? The term metaphysical poetry was coined by John Dryden and later popularized by Samuel Johnson in his book Lives of the Most Eminent English Poets. So, first we need to understand who coined the term. Who coined the term? John Dryden. And it was popularized by Samuel Johnson in his book Lives of the Most Eminent English Poets. But now we are going to see T.S. Eliot's essay Metaphysical Poets. Okay, so the word first we can understand the meaning of meta and physical. Meta means beyond, and physical means physical nature. So, metaphysical poetry means poetry that goes beyond the physical world of the senses and explores the spiritual. So, metaphysical poetry refers to a type of very intellectual poetry. So, it is a type of poetry dealing with abstract or philosophical subjects such as love, religion, God, beauty, faith, and so on. Right? So, the one thing you have to understand, meta means beyond physical. So, beyond physical nature, right? Something intellectual, something spiritual, right? So, metaphysical poetry began early in the Jacobean age, in the last stage of the age of Shakespeare. John Donne and his followers wrote metaphysical poetry in 17th century. And this tradition was revived in India and America in 20th century. Right? You can see in you know the term actually popularized by Samuel Johnson, but coined by John Dryden. So the group of people, the group of poets who started writing in the later period of Shakespeare, right? In Jacobean period itself, the later age of Shakespeare, people started writing about you know these type of poems deal beyond physical nature, deal with spiritual love, or deal with something intellectual, right? So who are the some of the popular poets, or who are the some of the people associated with these kind of intellectual poems? The metaphysical poets: John Donne, Andrew Marvell, Henry Wagon, Richard Crashaw, Robert Southwell, Abraham Covey, Sir William Davenant, Sir John Sutcliffe, and Thomas More. We have seen a number of poets in this group. There are a few poets like John Donne, Andrew Marvell, Henry Wagon, Richard Crashaw, very popular. Right? So, what are the characteristics of metaphysical poetry? Metaphysical poetry actually talks about deep things such as love, soul, religion, etc. And the most important characteristic of this poetry is a combination of feelings and thoughts. Right? Sometimes it is unclear. So because when you see the poem, every person takes something different out of the same poem based on their belief and understanding. Right? The same poem will be read by thousands of people. They get different meanings, different understanding based on their own beliefs. So the unusual comparison of things in poetry is one of its unique and most interesting characters. Right? We cannot imagine how it can be compared. These things can be compared with love. Like you can see when you see John Donne's poem, the compass can be compared with the love, right? How these things will be compared with love. Another unique feature of this poetry is platonic love. It is non-romantic. It is spiritual love and is mainly for God. Like, it talks about it is not you know the love here they express is not the physical, though it looks like physical love, the intimacy of lovers, but it talks about something spiritual. The spiritual love, intellectual love. So different critics view. Dryden and Johnson, being neoclassical critics, use this term metaphysical in a negative sense. Right? Johnson says the most heterogeneous ideas are grouped by violence together. Right? So when Dryden coined the term, it was not for the positive note. And when Johnson used that same term to popularize, even he was not used for the positive note. Whereas T.S. Eliot, right, gives this term metaphysical a place of harmony. He appreciated metaphysical poets. We all know that T.S. Eliot never accepted the romantic poets, right? So metaphysical people used the conceits, metaphors, something different, right? Not like romantic poets. So T.S. Eliot obviously liked those poets. The metaphysical poets and the new criticism. So 300 years later, new criticism refocused on these poets. T.S. Eliot called them intellectual poets rather than reflective. An ordinary man would smell a rose and then go read his newspaper, never connecting it to. A reflective poet would immediately gush, write a poem about the odor of the rose and never get to his newspaper. So imagine like when a person, uh, imagine like a routine life, right? When a person morning when he gets a newspaper and also uh, he, uh, he gets a, bunch of flowers. He smells the flower and he keeps the flower and then he started reading the newspaper. But is he's not carried away with the smell of the rose, right? So for him, these two different things, right? He is not connecting these two different things into one. Whereas if a person is a reflective poet, when he started, the flowers, immediately because of the smell of the flower, he started writing a poem. He will not go and read the newspaper. An intellectual poet, however, would somehow connect these two very desperate events, inform them into a new, right? So the reflective poet is here. He talks about romantic age poet, right? And intellectual poet like metaphysical poets. So metaphysical united the intellectual with the emotional, while the romantics merely dominated. Some say their poetry is too technical. Eliot said poets must do more than look into their hearts to write. That is not looking deep enough. Then looked into good deal more than the heart. One must look into the cerebral cortex, the nervous system, and the digestive tract. So, when you see poems which are related, right, talking about love and connecting the real life mechanical things which we use, that kind of things. How these things can be connected with the love. I can remember some of the movie songs which can be related to that. So, according to Grierson, metaphysical poetry has been inspired by a philosophical conception of universe and of the role assigned to the human spirit in this life. It arises when the physical world loses its stability and the people lose faith in the orthodox thoughts and beliefs. At such times, sensitive poets like Dryden turns inward and aim at a better understanding of themselves and the world around them. Um, Read this quote, and if possible, you can memorize this quote and use when you write your essay. It will be useful. It will fetch some good marks. The metaphysical poetry was published as a review of J. C. Grierson's edition of metaphysical types and forms of 17th century. Praising this edition, he proposes to consider the significance of the label metaphysical. Who is Eliot? Right? Eliot is quite conscious of the difficulties of the task he has undertaken. It is difficult to define the term metaphysical and explain the characteristics with differentiate metaphysical poetry from other kinds of poetry. It is difficult to decide which poets practiced it and which did not, and which of their verses have such characteristics. Because I have mentioned earlier that there were, group of people started writing about the similar kind of poetry that talking about intellectual love, talking about spiritual love, right? And connecting two different things which are, you know, normally we don't connect these things for writing love poems. We, in the sense that romantic poets, right? Only intellectual people can connect these things and write poems that too spiritual poems. So outwardly, when you see those poems, it talks about love. Sometimes it talks about the intimacy, the physical intimacy of lovers, but actually it talks about something beyond physical, something intellectual, something spiritual, right? So when he started talking about metaphysical, it is really difficult for him to differentiate metaphysical poetry from other kinds of poetry, right? And he tries to differentiate what is metaphysical poetry and how these poems are different from other poetry, you know. And he started uh, grouping metaphysical poets under one roof, but it is very difficult for him because uh, commonalities of these poets. He couldn't find such similarities. Every poet has, written something which is not common in other poets, right? So, three different schools of poetry. Donne, a late Elizabethan, Marvell, and Bishop King, who were very close to him. Okay, with John Donne. John Donne, uh, Andrew Marvell, and Ben Jonson and his courtly school of poetry, a kind of poetry which expired in the next century, and religious poetry of Herbert, Wagon, and Crashaw. So he differentiated these three different schools of poetry. It is difficult to find common characteristics among all those poets which are dominant enough to mark out these poets as constituting a separate distinct group. Right? So we can find uh, the characteristics of metaphysical poetry. Some of the characteristics we can find in John Donne and Morgan, so we can put them. And some of the characteristics we can find in Herbert, Wagon, Pressure, and some with even the Ben Jonson and his courtly school of poetry. Right? Combination of thought and feeling. Metaphysical poetry is a blend of passion and of thought. T.S. Eliot thinks that passionate thinking is chief mark of metaphysical poetry. There is an intellectual analysis of emotion in Donne's poetry, though every lyric arises out of some emotional situation. The emotion is not merely expressed, rather it is analyzed. So instead of expressing the emotion, they analyze like an experiment, scientific experiment. That is why, these poems are beyond physical nature. It is not something that spontaneous overflow or powerful feeling.